The prairie wind did not howl that morning. It whispered, like it was afraid to disturb her silence. She stood beneath the steeple's shadow, a slender figure in ivory lace, her hands trembling but not from cold. Her veil danced slightly in, the breeze catching bits of dust from the gravel road, but she didn't flinch. She hadn't flinched all morning. Not when the minister peered out the doors with a puzzled face. Not when the townspeople began to murmur. And not even when the groom's family left the chapel without a backward glance. The bells never rang. No one called her name. But then, no one ever had, because she had never spoken a word in her life. Her name was Mercy, and she had waited her whole life to belong somewhere. The church had once been a schoolhouse, long abandoned before the railroad cut through the valley, and settlers started building dreams on dust. She was found near that very track as a child, curled in a wicker basket, throat bruised from a wound that never healed. The midwife who raised her said she was born from silence, and that silence followed her into womanhood like a shadow that never left. But Mercy had something else in her, the fire of hope. Hope that someone would see past her muteness and into the roar of emotion within. She thought she had found him. The man had come from the city, polished, proud, with papers and promises, and the scent of cigar smoke. He courted her with nods and letters, words he claimed, he meant. She didn't know what love sounded like, but she knew what it looked like. At least she thought she did. That's how she ended up in borrowed white lace, standing under a sky that looked too big for broken hearts. That's how she came to be abandoned without a single word spoken. A mute bride left unheard, unloved, and unclaimed. The onlookers eventually left. No one wanted to part of silence and shame. The preacher folded his book and sighed. The organ boy closed the keys gently. Mercy stood still, watching a tumbleweed drift past the chapel door. Her bouquet loosened, petals falling one by one like soft declarations of a dignity no one else seemed to notice. And that's when she heard it, not through ears, but in the bones of the ground. A rumble, low and sure, drawing closer from this canyon road. Dust rose before the machine appeared, a deep black Studebaker, long as a riverboat and polished like obsidian. It moved like it had nowhere to be except here. And when it came to a slow stop before the chapel, Mercy turned. Just slightly. Just enough. The door opened with a hiss, and out stepped a man unlike the one who had abandoned her. This one wore no tie, no gloves, no polished shoes. Instead, he stood tall in rawhide boots, a dark Stetson shadowing sharp eyes. His jacket was long, black, and trimmed in silver braid military style, but faded like it had seen storms instead of ceremonies. He looked like a storm himself, one born of oil fields, broken treaties, and lonely riches. His name was not yet known, but later they would call him the Comanche oil baron. And in that moment, he looked not at the church, but straight at her. He didn't speak. She didn't move. The wind paused. Then slowly he walked toward her. Boots, crunching gravel. Time itself slowing to watch. He didn't stop at the chapel steps. He stopped in front of the dust on her shoes. Looked down at the girl in a ruined dress, veil tangled in wind, and silence brimming with sorrow. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or memory. Or maybe just the raw weight of seeing someone else's pain reflect your own. He extended his hand, not high, not low, but steady. No one would have dared. No one else ever had. Mercy didn't know who he was. But her fingers moved, her hand lifted, and in a quiet that felt more sacred than any prayer, she placed her hand. In his. No one saw the moment frontier redemption began. But it happened there, in silence, in dust, between a mute bride and a man who understood what it meant to be voiceless in a world that shouted only for power. He didn't take her into the church. He took her away from it, and the prairie watched, and the prairie listened. Because sometimes redemption doesn't arrive with trumpets or tears. Sometimes it pulls up in silence and simply stays. The road out of town was not made for women in wedding dresses. But Mercy didn't mind the dust. Inside the Studebaker, she sat in silence, because silence was all she had ever known. The Comanche oil baron didn't glance her way, not once, as he drove through the valley's long shadows and into the sun-baked stretch of land no one else dared to call home. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't say. But somehow, the journey itself felt like an answer. The land changed with every mile. The green of the riverbank faded into cracked earth, and rusted fences lined the path like scars of forgotten battles. Her veil caught the wind through the cracked window, fluttering like a white flag in a war she didn't remember starting. They passed no homes, no cattle, only vultures circling high, and oil derricks that creaked like metal skeletons in prayer. When the car finally slowed, she saw it, a house built of stone and sweat, sitting atop a hill that looked out over nothing. The house wasn't beautiful, it wasn't welcoming, but it stood, solid, like its owner. The front porch sagged in the middle, as though it once carried too much weight, and every window was shuttered tight, the paint peeling back like skin after a burn. No curtains, no flowers, no mirrors. He opened the car door. She stepped out. No one greeted them. No housekeeper, no dog, not even a whisper of another soul. The silence here was different. Not empty, just waiting. Mercy followed him inside. The floor creaked beneath her steps, like it hadn't felt a light foot in years. The house smelled of cedar, dust, and something else, maybe loneliness. He showed her to a room that looked like it hadn't been used in a decade. The bed was made clean. The quilt bore hand-stitched symbols she didn't recognize, patterns older than the land itself. There was no mirror on the dresser, just a brush, and a basin of fresh water, as if someone had known she would come. When she turned, he was gone. Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. Mercy didn't count. She stayed mostly in the room, sometimes on the porch, watching the sun carve shapes into the horizon. The oil baron was a ghost in his own home. He rose before the light, came back after dark, and his boots always carried the smell of metal and gasoline. She'd watch from the window as he dug with his own hands, turning the land until it gave in or gave up. And then, one evening, something changed. She found a package on the table, wrapped in brown paper, tied with a thin string. Inside was a pair of soft leather boots, crafted for a woman's feet, not new, but mended with care. Beneath them, a single folded paper. No writing, just a hand-drawn symbol. A spiral inside a square. She didn't know what it meant, but her fingers traced it like it had always belonged to her. That night, she walked outside. The stars above the valley didn't twinkle like in stories. They pulsed, deep and ancient. She stood on the porch with the boots on her feet and the night wrapped around her like a second dress. The wind whispered her name, or maybe it was just the sound of peace beginning. And far down the hill, she saw him. The oil baron stood beside a fire, a shovel stuck in the dirt, and something heavy in his posture, like a man waiting for judgment from a ghost. She didn't move. She didn't need to. He looked up just once, just enough, then turned back to the flames. The next day, the shutters were open, and inside the house with no mirrors, light touched the walls for the first time in years. Mercy didn't know what had broken him, but she knew deep in her bones that redemption was not a loud arrival. It was a slow unfolding, like morning after a long winter. And now it had begun. The house began to breathe again. At first, it was just small things. Dust swept from the window panes, the sound of water filling buckets, fresh logs stacked by the fireplace, though the nights were still warm. Mercy had not spoken, but her presence echoed through every room like a song without words. Her silence was not empty. It was deliberate, almost sacred. And though the oil baron never said a word either, something in the house had changed between them. He brought food without question. She left bread cooling on the sill. He fixed the broken gate. She stitched the torn curtain. They never shared a meal, but each gave what the other lacked without demanding anything in return. One day, she found him digging again, this time behind the barn. The sun was cruel above his head, beating down like justice owed. His shirt was soaked, his knuckles raw. She watched from the porch as he unearthed more than just dirt. Buried there were remnants of a life long ago. A rusted rifle, a rotted cradle, a child's beaded moccasin, small enough to vanish in her palm. The Baron knelt before the artifacts, like a man kneeling at his own grave. And when he rose, he didn't take them inside. He burned them. The fire roared out. It was not a fire for warmth. It was a funeral. That night, Mercy did not stay in her room. She stood by the dying flames, her dress lined with smoke and silence. She didn't ask who the child had been. She didn't need to. Some wounds didn't bleed anymore, but they still whispered from the ashes. And in that charred silence, she reached out, placing her palm over his heart. For the first time, he did not turn away. The days that followed passed like clouds, soft, forgettable, and strangely comforting. The town had nearly forgotten her. The preacher stopped asking questions. The townsfolk, once full of gossip, turned their eyes elsewhere. But whispers at the oil baron's return began to stir. Some said he had gone mad. Others claimed he was dying. But one old man, who had once worked as derricks, said something different. He's digging for more than oil now. He was right. What the baron wanted could not be bought or pumped from the ground. He wanted peace in a world that never gave him any. He wanted truth buried under years of betrayal, war, and stolen land. His father had struck the first well on land the Comanche were forced to sell for a bottle of whiskey and a forged deed. The son inherited the fortune and the shame. He left to outrun it. But money never softened guilt. Mercy found maps in the cellar, rolled up and brittle. Some marked with tribal boundaries, long erased by white borders. Others held hand-sketched. Lines, trails, and names no longer taught in schools. He wasn't just a baron. He was a man caught between two bloodlines, one conquered, one corrupted. And now, perhaps, he was trying to build something with what remained. One evening, Mercy wandered to the barn, drawn by the scent of oil and smoke. She found a trunk tucked behind an anvil. Inside were dresses not hers, but old ceremonial. Garments, Comanche beadwork, feathers, a shawl woven with ancient thunderbird patterns. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in silk, was a single photograph. A woman, smiling, holding a child. The child wore the same moccasins he burned weeks ago. The next morning, she placed the photo on the mantel. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. But when he saw it there, framed not in wood, but in memory, he stood still for a long time. Then, quietly, he touched the corner of the frame and nodded. Mercy had never spoken a word. But somehow, he heard her louder than anyone else ever had. And in that old house built on ash and iron, two broken lives began to stitch. Together, thread by invisible thread, frontier redemption was not yet complete. But the land had stopped bleeding. And the silence had started to sing. The rains came late that year, but when they arrived, they did not come gently. Thunder rolled like ancient drums across the valley, and the parched earth split with joy and agony all at once. Roofs leaked. Trails turned to rivers. But inside the stone house on the hill, the air held stillness, not panic. Mercy stood at the window, watching water pool beneath the wild mesquite trees. Her hands pressed against the glass, like she was trying to remember something she'd never known. She had never feared storms. Perhaps because her life had always been one. The oil baron had not left the house in 2 days. The rigs were shut, the men dismissed. He worked quietly in the cellar, hauling up boxes, some marked with oil company stamps, others with tribal crests, long faded. She caught glimpses, ledgers, letters, contracts that looked older than her own bones. The smell of ink, paper, and reckoning. That evening, he brought one of the boxes to the dining table, opened it, laid its contents out like evidence in a trial. Old deeds, a land registry, and tucked between the pages, a photograph torn in half. On one side, the woman with the thunderbird shawl. On the other, his father, in uniform, with a medal pinned to his chest. The paper had been ripped not in haste, but with precision. A divide clean as a blade between betrayal and belonging. Mercy understood, not because he said a word, but because the silence between them now held stories that no voice could carry Dot in the days that followed. People began to con Dot at first. It was just an elder from the East Reservation, wrapped in elk hide, with eyes like flint. Then another, a woman carrying baskets of herbs and salt. Soon they came from the valleys and the foothills, some walking for miles in worn-out boots, others in pickup trucks, older than the town itself. No one entered with ceremony. They came quietly, like they knew something sacred had begun again. Here the oil baron welcomed each one not with words, but with space. He cleared rooms, set tables, unlocked doors that had stayed shut for years. And Mercy? She moved through them like sunlight on cold stone, silent, warm, healing. One morning, she found a girl in the kitchen, no older than 10, dirty feet, bright eyes. The child stared at her as if trying to read her thoughts through her stillness. Then suddenly, she said it. "Your name's Mercy, ain't it?" It was the first time in years that someone had said her name out loud. She hadn't realized how much she missed hearing it. The sound felt strange, like a melody returned from the grave. She touched her chest and nodded, her eyes full. The little girl smiled wide. From that day on, the house was never truly silent again. The people who came brought not just voices, but stories, songs, recipes, and memory. Some had lost land, some had lost language, all had lost time. But on that hill, in a house with no mirrors and now wide-open shutters, they found something else, belonging. The oil baron held meetings by firelight. Maps were drawn. Land was returned piece by piece. He tore apart the false contracts, burned the ones soaked in greed, and began drafting new ones by hand. This time with witnesses. This time with truth. No newspaper told the story. No politician praised him, but word spread that the man who once vanished in shame had returned to right his father's wrongs. That he was giving away more than land. He was giving back a voice to a people silenced for generations. And always, at the edge of the porch, stood the mute bride. No longer waiting, but watching, holding in her presence a kind of strength that didn't need to speak, because every person who stepped onto that land knew they were standing in the center of something sacred. She was never introduced, but all of them somehow knew her name. Mercy. Not just a name anymore, but a promise. Spring brought color where no one expected it. Wildflowers bloomed in the cracks of stone fences, bright yellows and burning reds that no one had planted. The hill, once scorched and bare, now held rows of young saplings, each one staked with care, their roots wrapped in the soil of return. Mercy watched them from the porch each morning as the sun rose tall, still and watchful. She wore no veil now, only a shawl, soft and woven by hand, gifted by the same elder who first came to the house weeks ago. The thunderbird pattern on. Its back shimmered faintly when the wind moved. The oil baron had changed. He no longer carried the weight of silence like armor. His hands, once calloused from drilling iron in black earth, now turned pages of old treaties, family letters, and hand-drawn maps. His life had become a ledger of wrongs undone. He didn't speak often, but when he did, every word carried the weight of 100 quiet apologies. One morning, Mercy rose early and wandered down past the barn, where the foundation of something new was being built. Not a well, not a home, but a school, the kind without gates, where children could learn both history and truth, not from books alone, but from elders who still carried the past in their bones. Beside it, a large circular space had been marked with stones, a council ground. She knew what it was before anyone said it. A place for listening, for decision, for healing. She knelt beside one of the stones and ran her hand across it, freshly carved, not with a name, but with a symbol, a spiral and a square, the same one the oil baron had once left for her in silence. That evening, the townspeople came, not the ones who had turned their backs at the church, but new ones drawn by rumor, curiosity, and something else they couldn't name. They stood at the bottom of the hill, eyes wide, watching as the oil baron stepped forward, flanked by elders and children alike. Mercy stood beside him, her shawl rippling in the twilight. No one introduced her, No one needed to. Every soul there knew the shape of redemption when they saw it. He raised his hand, not in power, but in offering, and pointed to the fields below. It was land he was giving back, not through sale, not through compromise, but through restoration. A return to those who had once bled for it. Some in the crowd scoffed. Others wept. But no one left unchanged. That night, under the stars, drums echoed across the valley. Not for celebration, but for remembrance. Mercy sat by the fire, surrounded by women who hung stories into her hands as they wrapped her fingers in string and beads. They didn't need her to speak. They saw in her eyes what many never had the courage to say. That sometimes silence isn't absence. It's power. The oil baron approached her just before dawn. His face was not the one from the city. It was older now, lined with wind and memory. He held something small in his palm. A ring, not gold, but iron twisted and reshaped. From one of his own tools. Forged in fire. Softened in purpose. He didn't kneel. He simply offered. Mercy reached out slowly and took it. No. Church bells rang, but something louder moved through the valley. A quiet acceptance, a sacred vow, a beginning, born from every broken thing that had come before. Years passed, but time moved differently on the hill. The town below changed. Buildings rose. Rail lines stretched, and voices filled the air where once only dust had settled. But the house on the hill remained just as it was, still, enduring, and alive in a way that stone and timber should not be. People still came, some with stories, others with questions. And a few came just to see her, the woman in the shawl, who never spoke, yet somehow healed what years of shouting had failed to fix. Mercy never left the hilltop. Not because she couldn't, but because that land had finally become the one place she didn't have to run from. The oil baron aged like iron, weathered, but unbending. His hair turned gray, then white, and still he walked the paths he had built by hand, planting trees where old debts had once lived. Every child who passed through that land was taught the truth of who they were, what had been taken, and what could never be taken again. He built no monuments to himself, but Mercy became one. They never married in the church. That place, long since abandoned, stood now as a warning that love without honor collapses in silence. Instead, their bond was marked in the very soil they restored together, carved through shared hands, quiet service, and a kind of fierce, wordless devotion that echoed louder than vows. When the oil baron finally passed, it was not in sickness or sorrow. It was in peace. He died by the window, a worn journal on his lap, its last page empty, left for someone else to fill. The town lit lanterns in his honor, and the people gathered not with grief, but with gratitude. He had returned what his father stole. He had burned the paper lies. He had left the earth more honest than he found it. They offered to carve his name into stone. Mercy refused. Instead, she placed the iron ring he had forged onto the branch of their first planted tree. No, tall, wide, and blooming with red flowers that had no name. She tied her shawl around its trunk and stepped back. No tears. Just truth. And then she disappeared. Not from the world, but into it. They say she still walks the valley, barefoot in spring, shawl trailing behind her like mist. Children hear her first, feel her presence before they see her. A woman with soft eyes and strong silence. A woman who needs no words to be understood. They call her Mercy, not because it was her name, but because she became the meaning of it. And the land? The land still tells her story, not with monuments or sermons, but in the way the trees lean toward the wind. In the way the river curves to cradle wildflowers. And in the way every soul who climbs that hill learns that redemption does not always come in fire and thunder. Sometimes it arrives slowly. In silence, and stays forever.